good morning, or whatever time of day it is that you choose to watch. Or I feel like that's assuming people are watching this. My name is Tim Rush, and I'm one of the ministers at Memorial Drive Church of Christ, and this is Jason Thornton. We are co-preachers with this body, and we are recording these conversations because these are the conversations we generally have in our office. Since we aren't officing together right now, we have these conversations on Zoom, and we hope that it blesses someone besides ourselves, but we're blessed by them either way.
There you go. And the first part, we don't script any of these, and if that's not obvious to you, you give us way too much credit. But the first part, we'll just talk about the sermon and kind of explore the themes in the sermon, and then we'll hopefully have the wherewithal to take a break, transition to kind of what we call the art of preaching. Not that we're the artists, we're the learners of the art of preaching. So great job Sunday. Loved it coming out of Philippians 2 and 3. And so the thing, just even processing through the message, like through the pacing, that the first point you made about, here Paul is, and the whole theme is lessons in lockdown, and how COVID meets Philippians kind of thing. You might want to learn that title before you.
I know, I can't remember the title of our sermon series.
Yeah, they all run together. Anyway.
And right before we started, I asked Shane, tell me how to say this title again. 2 seconds later, I can't say it.
So this idea of you're under heavy restriction, and what can we learn in watching Paul when he's under heavy restriction? And so that first idea, that, because I hadn't really thought in these terms, Paul is a guy that's been used to, for a long time, even pre-Christian life, having the power and the finances to go where he wanted to go. Mm-hmm. And then in Christian life, he still, without the finances, even at times, he went where he wanted to go. And he was the most chronicled traveler, maybe in the whole Bible, but certainly in the New Testament. Just went, people, and so very much a driver personality, very much aware that people were obviously a central part of the kingdom of God. And so just meeting, how many thousands of people did Paul know? And then all of a sudden his world is, shrunk down so tight, and he doesn't know if it'll ever be different. And so there is a lot to lament. There's a lot to mourn. And yet his spirit seems the opposite. So you almost have two options. Either he has no awareness at all, like he's so oblivious, he's lost his mind, or he's coming from a totally different frame of reference. And of course, that's our perspective. He sees things totally different. And so this thought that you let us in about, notice that Paul is stripped of so many relationships, and yet what he did have, he maximized. So pouring into Timothy and to Epaphroditus, and then to give us the question, the challenge of who is it that God has given you? And not some generic question, not the world or, everyone you'll ever meet, but specifically right now, who has he given you to reach to? And then the thought, and I love this, that your phone book, the list of numbers you have in your telephone, your cell phone, is beyond Paul's imagination in terms of reach. I don't think about it that way, but it's exactly right. So it's not just the people in my house. I have everyone I have access to on my phone, and then obviously whatever other technological connections we can have. And so I love that thought. I think one of the devil's chief accusations, his chief lies, is to say you make no difference. The struggles you've been through, they don't matter. The work that you've tried to do to grow in your Christ-likeness, in your connection with God, in your marriage. I interact with people all the time that feel like they've done a lot of work in their marriage, and at the moment I'm talking to them, they feel like it did no good. And that message is so consistent. It's like, I'll bet you that's one of the chief tools of the devil, is to make us only focus on our limitations. that which we can't do or don't feel good about.
Yeah. Yeah. When you think about, and we talked about parenting last week, but that idea of being in a discipling relationship with those that you're the closest to, and I think of Kim and the kids, that is such an intimidating zone to move into because they know me better. You know, it's one thing to preach to people who don't live with me and don't see me get grouchy, don't see me make bad choices, but to have these honest discipleship conversations with Kim and the kids, it makes it different, because they know all of my weaknesses. So we have these conversations about what do we want life to look like? What does following God look like? And it brings accountability into the conversation, because you can't just pretend, okay, this is what we all agree on, and I'll see you again in a week, and you have no idea if I've lived this way or not.
Right.
So I think of, when we think about who has God left in front of you, whoever that is right now, it's probably the people that you would be the most vulnerable with. Either people in your own home, or if you are maintaining contact with them, there's some sort of level of vulnerability that they know you better than anyone else. And I even think that that's a gift to us right now, that's God saying, put your money where your mouth is. Step into this with people who know you and can hold you accountable, that they know, are you living what you're preaching? And that's Paul's point at the end. Take note of me. Take note. You've seen it. Follow me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you don't think about that with that caveat of take note of me. I'm going to screw this up. So what are those implications?
Yeah.
So let me throw this out there. This just popped in my head, but the idea of, I think you're absolutely right. The ones that we have access to now are probably our people. Are the place we feel we allow ourselves to be the most vulnerable. The place we feel it could be safest. It just depends on your relationships in your home. But these are the people that certainly know you best. So then it popped into my mind, when Jesus says a prophet has no honor in his hometown, I've always taken that statement to be, honestly, don't even try in your hometown. Don't even try with the people that know you best, because they're just going to judge you and this kind of thing. But then I'm wondering, am I really misreading that? Misunderstanding not the statement itself, but the impact of that statement.
Yeah.
Because you could say a prophet is without honor in his hometown, so do what you can with your family, but they're your family. They're not going to accept you. And I hear people say this all the time about their parents in particular. My parents will never listen to me because I will perpetually be the child.
Yeah.
And I can relate to that, certainly. But I'm wondering, number one, I don't know enough about Jesus' travels to know if after he said that, if he ever went back to his hometown. I just can't draw that to mind right now. In my mind, I think he kind of, shook the dust off and never went back, but I don't know that that's true. And as I'm thinking through, I'm like, I'll bet you he went back to his hometown many times. So I guess what's popping up in my head is he's acknowledging there's less honor among the people that get to see you more than once a week. There's less honor with those people, but that doesn't, maybe there's another message there too that says, now I may be so reaching here. When I feel honored by a group of people, I'm much more likely to weigh in with confidence. Mm-hmm. When I feel dishonored with a group of people, I'm much more likely to not weigh in, and much more likely to be so careful or second guess myself, And I can tell you this for truth. When I've led stuff in my family, like devotional thoughts or this kind of thing, and they push back a little bit, like I'm talking a slight side look. You know what I mean? I'm done. I tried. But I would never come to church and be leading something and look over and somebody's like dead asleep and I'm like, I'm out. You know what I mean? I mean, honestly, if somebody's dead asleep when you're preaching, that they're not honoring you. I mean, they may be exhausted, so I give them grace, and yet I would preach all day long with the person sleeping, because I feel, generally speaking, I'm in an honored position as that preacher. So I wonder if there's this doesn't detract from the truth of that message, but if that's not a stop sign, if you're going to have to dig in even more to trusting God when you're in a space where they don't give you honor.
Yeah, that's fascinating because I've never thought about that. So, and this just makes me wonder how many places in the Bible have we finished a sentence Jesus didn't finish?
Wow, that's good.
Prophet is without honor in his own home. I finished the sentence, therefore, go someplace where you're honored. He didn't say that. He's just making an observation. Hey, it's going to be rough.
And certainly he made especially towards the end, he made a practice of going where he was dishonored.
Yeah.
Like, you're like, why are you in the Pharisee's house again? This does not go well. I'm like, stop that.
Yeah. So it is interesting, just because it's not the place you are the most esteemed does not mean avoid that place.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think of a lot of times we'll assess, and I think there can be wisdom here, certainly, but we will make as our guide, our standard, is this good? Am I going to be effective here? And I think we do this in all different situations, not just family, but we'll say, man, I just feel like I should say something to them. I feel like they're doing something that's really going to hurt them spiritually. But then we'll say, well, am I the effective person to speak into this? Am I the one to do this? And what we're saying, another way we could say it is, I don't think they would really honor what I say. And I think we say that about our families. I think we get to a place that we're just like, look, especially if we tried it once and it didn't go well, look, they're just not going to honor me, so I will say nothing. And that's what you're saying about we finish the sentence. Could he say, a prophet is without honor in his hometown, so you're going to have to dig deep into trusting God as you are led by him to speak to this group?
And so I've been thinking about this weekend because we have all of our family in. My brother and sister both have their families in from Atlanta. So Sunday they came over we all had church together. And we didn't turn the videos on. We could have watched Dusty's church in Atlanta, or we could have watched Memorials. I watched it later because I feel like that's part of what we are. But as a family, we just sat down and we did house church like we would have done it in Mexico. So intimidating to do it with family. And because what we do is we sit down and we say, all right, our custom is to say, so what did you hear from God this week? And if it's he's put a song on your heart since you woke up this morning, you want to sing that, or if you feel led to lead a prayer, that's how we do it. In Mexico, even with people that I think I don't know if these people spent time with God this week, so what will this look like? And I mean, neighborhoods where we're planting churches, these people are not yet Christians sometimes, but we're starting and seeing how will it go, is not as intimidating as with my family who I know are Jesus followers. And so I was thinking, why is that? Why do I feel so much nervous? And it's that voice in my head that says, you are Timmy. You are the little brother. Yours is the last voice that deserves to be open or heard when we are all together. And I thought, okay, so I know that's not true. But it's whenever we have, like when we're all together at Christmas, I feel like the Timmy that's helping in the garage and isn't really sure, is it a Phillips screwdriver that Dad wants? And so I had to imagine Dusty and Wendy, bring their own voices to the table. You know, I don't know what they are, but Dusty's the middle child. And so he's not the oldest and he's not the youngest. And Wendy's the oldest child, who's probably, I mean, we are all virtually the same age. We are 47, 48, and 49. But she was given responsibility, probably that she shouldn't have had to carry over two brothers who wouldn't listen, and would break things anyway, and she would get held accountable to it. So what sort of tangled messes of voices do we hear when we're together that I don't know? I look at them as they're the ones that have it all together, you know, and I'm still trying to figure it out. And so I think even when we think about being in a discipleship relationship with our own families, like one of the things I think of is Kim knows my mistakes. Kim knows my where I have failed miserably. My kids have seen me at my worst. And so those are the messages that come up when I think about, I want to have these conversations with my kids about X, but they know how I've messed that up, how I've not done well. So it is, I want to push pause and say, don't have that conversation. Whereas I think God is trying to bring me into it, because there is beauty there, even in my, maybe even more so in my weaknesses, in the places I messed up the most, that I don't want to shed more light on. But God's like, man, that's where I'm going to show up. And that's where it's going to be even better. Which then that sounds a lot like the pattern. Are you willing to die to yourself so that it can provide life for other people? Sorry, you were going to say.
So that I was going to say that brings me to my second point, but I need to comment one more thing on your first point, is that I have found myself at so many tables, you know, drinking coffee with people, and they start to talk to me about something. And I mean, this is not like 30 years ago. It happened 30 years ago, but this is like, you know, last month. And they start talking to me, and I'm like, why are they talking to me? I don't know anything. What would I say to them? Like, I've never even had that experience. Or I feel in that exact same way. You know, what would I have to say to them? And one of the things I've reminded myself of, and will often share with them, is 7+ billion people walking on this earth today. And in this moment, you and I, Tim, are talking to each other. Now, it doesn't mean everything, but it also means something. It doesn't mean nothing. And I think, okay, if I'm the one that God allowed to show up here, and you're the one that God allowed to show up here, and that's true in a momentary, this second, and true in, you know, your life, our life patterns. I mean, how many variables are at play in our history that would cause us not to be here in this moment? You know, how many variables would cause your household to look different right now? For you not to have one kid and have another kid, for you not to have married that spouse, for you not to have those children. You know, I mean, it just the variables are infinite, and yet here you are. And I think that matters. And I think that's, I don't think Paul would have said it that way. But I do wonder, did he think that way? Okay, I don't have access to all of Philippi. I don't have access to, of course, he wrote a letter to speak to that, but I don't have access to Corinth and these other places, or to places I have yet to go. But I do have Timothy. But I do have Epaphroditus. And I think that's where the honor comes from. God has given me the honor to speak to you right now, Tim. And then if he gives me the honor, gives you the honor that other people would listen to this, then he's given us the honor of speaking to them. And then the people that hear this, then they have the choice. Will they recognize the honor that God has given them to share whatever he shares with this to the next person? You know what I mean? Yeah. God is the one that brings the honor, even if the people, the listeners, a family doesn't. And just to really, I think a lot of our Christianity, in terms of a lot of our Christ following, in terms of making improvement, it's not so much behavior modification as choosing to reframe it from his perspective. You know, and that's one of those things. So you did talk about pattern. For those of us that went to any kind of Bible college or Bible training program, that the word tupos is a very popular word in some of those settings, pattern. At least it was 30 years ago. And often they would talk about that word tupos as if tupos is a pattern for how we structure our church organization, for how we structure our Sunday mornings, for who gets to speak and who doesn't get to speak, and what order, when you pray and when you take Lord's Supper and these kind of things. And the point you made is a point that I've seen in other passages, certainly, and applies here in Philippians 3, that the tupos there, the pattern there, has nothing to do with what should our elders be like, you know what I mean? Or should you hire a preacher? It has everything to do with the pattern of living where you have a desire to know Christ, want to know Christ, the power, and recognize his power. And then you make a choice to share in his suffering, becoming like him in his death, and then he resurrects you. And this daily death to self should be, you get baptized. And what is baptism? It's that first time you're really taking on this idea of, or physical expression at least, of I'm dead, I'm dying to myself, I'm being raised with Christ. But that's the first of a billion times that you recognize I'm dead or I'm dying to myself. I put myself down so that he can raise me up. That's the pattern in Christianity. And I think anything less than that, we get really aware of what we like and we elevate our preferences. And then whatever power we're given, we enforce those preferences on other people. And that to me is the crux of the problem with church in general, is this fact, if I'm not constantly dying to myself, then my preferences will meet whatever power I have, and I become the Pharisee in that situation. And I don't mean to necessarily, but man, it's just so predictable.
Yeah, Dad was talking to me about this morning, about how there's so much life in what's going on in our surroundings right now, even in good friends and family members that have just passed away. There is life in all of this because we just don't know what God is up to. And then he kind of turned back towards this COVID situation, and everything is new. Everything's going to be recreated. And he gave his same warning, but if we're not careful, no matter what it is that we recreate, we will then put the limits on it. And this is how it now needs to be. And it reminded me of Canoeing the Mountains, I think it was, that had the statement about today's solutions will be the source for tomorrow's problems. Whatever it is that we come up with to solve the problems, the next generation will have to deal with. What problems did those solutions create? And that's not to say don't try to find solutions, but it is to say once you find them, don't think that that's God's gift to eternity. And we can feel it right now with online church. And there's this sense among ministers of how now people want this. How am I going to recreate it when I also have every other job I've always had? I really feel like memorials, like even the meeting we had with our elders this morning, where they're looking at Shane going, okay, how can we continue this? But Shane, we don't want this to have to be your job now. What do we need to do to support you? Right. And I feel bad for other ministers that don't have our elders and don't have that understanding. They're now putting new jobs on people that don't have the bandwidth to carry through with everything that they've received so far.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so let's concoct for a moment. Well, no, we don't even concoct. I'm thinking of a dynamic that it's so good, it's just so good, and then it would cut against. And what pops in my head is years ago at Memorial, when a person would come down to the front. So if you have an invitation song in your service, if you're watching somebody else watching this, or an altar call, the idea is a person would come down and they would share a prayer request or a confession or something of that nature. And usually that is a very lonely experience. Growing up, that was a very lonely experience, and one I learned don't do it, because you'd go down there, and number one, you'd be alone, physically alone, and number two, the person that shared your story may not be what you just told them, and then number three, some of the people in the audience were like, oh, I know what he did, and all of a sudden everybody now has a reason to share the prayer request gossip that you have. And so there was actually a group of teens at Memorial that they came back from camp, and when a teen came down, like 25 teenagers came and gathered around them, so they would not be alone. And that's something that not immediately, but Memorial has adopted over the years, that if somebody comes down, even if no one knows them, but especially if somebody knows them, more people join them, so they're not alone. And there's expressions, so there's prayer there, there's expressions of grace there, understanding, this kind of thing. It's a beautiful thing. I love it, Now we're in COVID. And let's say, for argument's sake, let's make COVID the worst case scenario, that we never leave COVID, that we have to social distance until the day of our death, which that's depressing, I understand. I don't think that's the way it's going to go, but let's say it is. What if we as a church were like, no, we always come forward, and we always surround this person, and we just real tight, you know what I mean? And even if people were saying, well, wait a minute, you could get sick and this kind of thing, we're like, no, and this is such a ridiculous dynamic, but I think we're trained to do this all the time, where we see there was a solution that the church in 1950 came up with, and man, it is so hurting us in reaching to the generations today. But people are like, no, that thing that we came up with in the 1950s, that was from the mouth of God himself, even though it's not in the Bible, even though you cannot even make a biblical case for it with any authenticity or logic, but we have to hold on to it. I don't care if it hurts our children. I don't care if no one can connect with us in the culture today. This is what we believe. And I'm telling you, I'm not making that story up. That story happens. And the thing I'm adding to that story is I am as prone as anyone else to do the same thing if I'm not super careful.
Yeah.
So no matter what good, like you said, no matter what good solution I come with, oh, this will really encourage people to know Jesus, I have to hold that like this, not like this, because I need to be willing to die to that great idea for God to live, and especially as time passes.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's so easy to spot in anybody else, but it's so hard for me to realize, oh, I'm doing it.
Yeah.
There's something that it's just a part of me. It's been ingrained, and so now to do it differently, what will that be like? Mm-hmm. We've talked about how one blessing of being moved over to Eastside is we're in somebody else's building. And so we've had to make a pretty awkward request of people that they don't take donuts and coffee throughout the building. And we feel like bad guys to say, hey, it's not our place. And there are coffee spills and OJ spills all the time at Memorial. Mm-hmm. But while we're here at Eastside, we got to keep it in this one room. And I feel like it was the first 2 weeks you were saying to me, have you noticed the life that happens in that 9 to 9:30 half hour? Because in the past, people would go by the donuts and coffee and they would move on to their classes. Now they have to come early and they have to sit in this room, and there's so much life because they're talking and they're visiting. And it starts with that awkward thing of like, please don't take this out of the room. Right. Nobody wants to be told where you can't drink coffee, but we kind of have to because it's not our house. And so we feel like, oh no, this isn't the way we do things. And it ends up, it's a huge gift. And I mean, that's just such a simple illustration, but it's not when you think about somebody's reaction could be, well, you're not going to tell me where I can do things. And anytime that statement is made, well, you're not going to tell me, I feel like that ought to be our clue. Hey, this isn't death, burial, resurrection language.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think I know the plane tried to interrupt you there, but That is so true, and how beautiful it is. And I don't want to make small things big things, but I do think what we do in the small is ultimately what we're going to do in the big. So I love eating donuts while I listen to my class, and I love drinking coffee while I'm even teaching a class, you know.
Mhm.
So I could think that's not a big deal. It's so stupid. It's so stupid. I'm not going to spill it. I know me, blah blah blah, you know. But to be have the pattern and say, you know what, if that's what needs to happen, I die to myself to drinking coffee. I die to myself and eating a donut, which granted, for me, it blessed me greatly to die to myself and eating a donut. But it's that idea that I think we make it unspiritual and we make it about our rights. And of course, you see that a lot right now in our culture where everything is politicized, because we say, well, yeah, Jesus stuff, but what about my rights? And we have to recognize our rights are the very thing Jesus is asking us to die to.
Yeah.
And it's not some side issue for Jesus. I mean, it's like you can go to church every Sunday and you can take communion and you can be baptized and you can, I don't know, knock doors or whatever you want. But if you are not willing to die to your rights, you are not a Christ follower. I mean, I don't know how to be more direct than that. But if you're like, but I will never die to my rights, and like, well, then you're not a Jesus person. You are a person that talks about Jesus and intends stuff about Jesus, but the death to self is the core. You don't get more fundamental than dying to yourself so that you can love others. And Jesus even says this. He said, if you only love the ones you love, and I think we could extrapolate to the things you love, you're just like the pagans if you only love your preferences. It's when you can go to a space where you're like, I wouldn't do it that way. I wouldn't say it that way, but I'm dying to myself to love them. Now you're like Jesus in that situation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like that has to be a message that we have to keep stepping into, because when we come back out of our quarantines, we will have people on each end of the spectrum wanting what they want. And we have to find a place to respect what each other want. Um, yeah. And I just don't get the not having grace for what somebody else, even what they think they need. Even if I don't agree that they need it or not, if they think that they need it, yeah, it just doesn't make sense to me. Why we would feel the need to exercise my rights over theirs.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. I don't even know what our time is, but talk to me about, just from the art of preaching perspective, kind of how this sermon felt, anything you picked up on, anything you were reminded of while you were doing the preparation.
Yeah, it was weird. It's the first time I preached standing up in a while. That's a silly thing to say, but it was different. An odd situation, but I really, I thought that we'd be preaching this whole time in front of that stage, in front of that cross. And that cross really does have a lot of meaning to me, like that specific, that says to me that's like one of those milestones where I feel like God says, I will provide.
Yeah.
So that's really special to me. But the first Sunday we did preach in there, and the sound was so bad, we didn't have the same mics that Shane has now, that whenever I was done preaching, Shane said, the sound's horrible. We've got to do it again. And you can't go 30 minutes. So I feel like I've shared that before, but if anybody out there is grateful, we're only preaching for 15 minutes. Tell Shane, thank you.
That's right.
And I do feel like as far as preaching goes, trying to get it into 15 minutes, that really, it helps guard from the rabbit trails that I just instinctively want to, and let me talk about this also. But it helps you realize, no, what was I here to say? And let's stay on that point. Not to say it doesn't still happen, but I feel pretty certain that it happens a lot less often.
Yeah. So that raises an interesting question. So eventually, we'll be back on the stage and people will be in the auditorium. Do you think people's attention spans will expand to 25 minutes, or will we need to stay at 15?
Well, I think for that first season, we'll need to stay at 15 just to try to keep it. I think Shane's going to be very purposeful in keeping our gatherings to an hour.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
Besides that, honestly, I feel like people would adjust quickly back to the 20-25 minutes. But I'll be honest with you. I feel like generally, and I may be overstating this, but I feel like I'm generally one of the ones with the least, with the smallest attention span. I remember doing small groups with a family that had 3 special needs kids. And this is the early days of small groups, as far as we know of small groups in the Church of Christ, where you had to have these pieces to make it a really good small group. And I would notice, hey, the 3 kids, they're done. You know, their parents could get them to, 2 of the 3, they could get them to sit quietly for a short time, and then they're done, and the group leader would keep going. And I would always think, you know what? When I'm noticing that they're done, I am too.
Mm-hmm.
My attention span is done. So why don't we cut it down to what our attention spans actually are, instead of trying to create something, because that's what a book tells us we're supposed to have all of these elements in place. But yes,
Yeah, that does raise the question about, or the concept of our expectations, especially in preaching. Like, what makes good preaching? What makes a good sermon? How long is it? I'm talking about for the preacher. What needs to be said? Can you have a good sermon and you only read scripture? Can you have a good sermon and you never reference scripture? Can you have a good sermon and you have no illustrations or a lot of illustrations? And probably we could go through this and think, oh, I know a preacher that's like that. He never has illustrations, or this guy only shares illustrations. And I think that plays, so to the preachers out there, and you'll know this if you're a preacher, but that plays on you. Like without even knowing it, you'll say, well, wait a minute, it's got to have these things.
Yeah.
You know, like the guy leading your small group, you know, it's, well, I don't care who's paying attention. We have to have these 5 steps or whatever.
Well, and you think about that, that voice that I was referring to, of this is who you are. And this is, I feel like we as preachers have that same thing. Anytime we hear somebody talk about another preacher, it reflects on us. What do people think about me? And so you'll hear another preacher talked about, if he really, his sermons are just packed full of scripture. And you feel like, oh no, am I using enough scripture? Mm-hmm. And I mean, to the other extreme, I feel like I've heard preachers that it seems like, man, what demons are you fighting that everything you say has to be book, chapter, and verse? I bring you greetings today to the Memorial Drive Church of Christ, Romans 16:16. And in a moment we will, and it just feels like, man, what's going on? And that's actually caused me to, like, well, I don't want to be that guy. And so what is my lane for speaking? And then I hear people say, man, the way Jason does it.
That loser. Well, I will say, this idea of finding your own voice, when I first started preaching classes, I remember one of my teachers said, you have the most unique monotone. And in my mind, I'm like, I'm Mr. Passionate. And he's like, yeah, you start passionate, you stay passionate, you end passionate. I mean, it's like everybody else is like, calm down, you know? And it's because in a I didn't even recognize the voice first. My dad is very charismatic. Now, he wasn't doing what I did, but in my mind, good preaching was always being charismatic. So you read the scripture like you're acting in a melodrama, and you know what I mean? And still there are times I'll tap into that, but that's just an example. I know guys that they in the past where they were heavily influenced by a person with an accent. And so when they start preaching, they carry an accent. I know guys that had illustrations. You know, some of these people, they had illustrations that they'd heard significant preachers in their life do. And when they get to that place, their physical voice would change to match and mimic the way they did it, because that's the pick. And until you, and it's not bad to learn something and then, represent it. But it's just the idea of, if we have to be introspective to see what is pushing me. I don't know if I told you this, but I told you, I don't know if I said it on one of these. So the deal where I was asked to speak at a local middle school, and I was going to speak to their student body. We have a relationship with that school with Monroe. And so initially they were like, you have 15 minutes. So I'm all working on 15 minutes to 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And what would that look like? And I'm going to be funny in this way. And then the day of, I show up, and the guy says, hey, you'll have about 5 minutes. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I'm working 5 minutes. What's my best stuff? And I'm on stage with the principal, and she goes, you're going to have about 2 minutes. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I just shut down. And so I made a joke, and the rest of it, I just thought, I basically was saying, please shoot me now, just over and over again. I just felt so dumb up there. And I missed an opportunity to let God work because I was so self-conscious, and it was fine. I'm sure I don't even remember what I said. I just remembered there's a big difference from me being relaxed in the spirit and letting him work versus me trying to figure out how to adapt, because what's happening there really is I have all these expectations, and I'm asking myself subconsciously at first, as you become aware more consciously, how do I fit all these pieces into a shorter and shorter and shorter time? And I think God gives us those opportunities to see, do you see that you're really trusting in your preparation? You're really trusting in your funniness. You're really trusting in your structure. You're really trusting in your memorization instead of trusting me with those things.
Yeah. And my heart hurts because I'm thinking about the time that I did that, giving a mission presentation to a large church, and it was really weird. Like, they really wanted PowerPoint to be used, and I had no experience with PowerPoint. I had no idea what I was doing. So when you don't know what you're doing, you're talking about hours of preparation that somebody else could do in 20 minutes, but you can't. You've not done this before. And they were very specific about not being a Devo talk, but like it was supposed to be a long presentation and all the things that they wanted in it. And on a Sunday night, and I'm thinking, man, when I preached on Sunday nights, I didn't want to go. Nobody wants to be there on Sunday night, but now I'm roped into this PowerPoint. And when you got a PowerPoint, you got to do what the next slide says. Right. And so then the joker that introduces me, who's the same one that's telling me exactly what they want, he gets up and says, Tim's just going to talk for a few minutes about Guadalajara. I'm like, no, you said, why would you say a few minutes? And I basically, that was my introduction. Hey, I'm sorry he told you I'm going to be here for a few minutes, but I've got this clicker to a PowerPoint. I've got to go through it. And I feel like I should have called an audible and just said slide, sorry, and moved on. But I think I talked to him for 45 minutes, and nobody wants to be there for 40 of those. I didn't want to be there for 40 of those. Oh man, I wonder why that church dropped my support.
I will say that the message that is so important to me, and it goes back to even you talking about Wendy earlier and what messages, but all of the family, I'm trying to figure out how to say this well. We make a huge mistake by denying what is actually going on in our own hearts and heads as a preacher, and then just getting up to do our jobs. Mm-hmm. That is part and parcel. God uses the whole of you every time. And part of our responsibility is, yes, to study the word, is yes, to figure out context. It's yes, to think through the presentation and the homiletic dynamics and all these kind of things. But it's equally important to know what's going on inside of you. We've talked about this a lot in the past. If I get up angry, I don't care what the sermon is, it's going to come across my anger, and
Yeah.
it's going to distort what I'm teaching because I'm not aware how angry I am. I preached a lesson one time, and the whole point was peace. And it was a workshop, a Tulsa workshop class, a session. I had 45 minutes or so, and I got in there and I had all this stuff, and I'm just like, rah, 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 rah. And Lita Blevins, I love her for telling me this. This is when I learned I could trust her. But she turned to her friend after the class was, and she said, I've never been so stressed out studying about peace in my life. And I made this huge mistake, is that I didn't stop to be at peace myself before I delivered a message about peace. And I'm not suggesting you get angry when you're going to talk about anger, although I think if you're going to honestly talk about anger, you need to tap into how you're angry, you know? But I think it's just this kind of disconnect. I'm not going to be myself. I'm going to be a preacher role. And I think that's directly opposite of God's design of us, to bring our full selves to the message.
Okay, so couple thoughts, and I'm putting this out there as I think we need to talk about this next time, because I've got to get off this call and get to the food pantry here pretty quick. But when you follow where God, I'm talking to preachers here, whenever you follow, this is what I thought I was going to talk about, this is what I had planned, but this is just what's real for me today, and I think maybe that's from God. You will get feedback that says, why would you do that? That was horrible. You showed vulnerability and we shouldn't have seen that. Or it could be something you've not done before. And so maybe you made a mistake in how you did it. Maybe you felt angry and you don't allow yourself to feel angry. So then you made a mistake in being too angry. I mean, all of those things are possible, but the feedback you get doesn't, if the feedback says don't ever do that again, that's not necessarily the feedback you need to listen to. So there's always someone telling you you're doing it all correct, and you need to not be always listening to them. And there's somebody always telling you you are always doing it wrong, and you need to not always listen to them either. So I feel like we need to talk about how do we know who to listen to and whose advice to take, when honestly we could easily fall into either of those camps of always listening to the one who they're not listening to God, but they come across so strong that I feel like they say it so powerfully, they must be right and I need to listen. Mm-hmm. And those who are just always so encouraging and so thoughtful, but they're not really giving me good advice either. They're not being honest. They're just telling me I'm doing it right.
Yeah.
I feel like and that's not just for preachers. I feel like that's anybody in leadership. Somebody is telling you you're doing it all right, and you probably need to go, I need to check and hear another voice. And somebody's telling you you're doing it all wrong, and you need to check for another voice. So
excellent. I've written it down, so we'll try to remember to do that next week. And so as always, just very grateful, especially to anyone that has made it this long. Tim and I love this, but we recognize it as a certain death to self to last this long. But if there is anything that pops up for you as a participant, that you would want more discussion, something we said that you're like, that doesn't even make sense, we would love to engage that. So just let us know in our respective Facebook pages, and we'll pick up whatever we need to do in response to that. But thank you so much for being part of it. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Jason.
All right. Bye.